breaking and entering, drunk and disorderly, law and order. A former prosecutor and a defence barrister, not your usual pairing. And the result? Conversations about crime and punishment that are guaranteed to get you thinking.
Welcome to Justice Matters, a weekly podcast with Lizzie Green and Jay Merchant. Our episodes are every Monday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Follow us on Instagram at Justice Matters Pod for clips. Enjoy the episode. This episode deals with domestic violence. Discretion is advised. All right, Liz, welcome.
Hi, Jay. How are you?
Good to be back. Hey, before we get started on this topic, I want to raise something that was mentioned to me on social media.
Oh,
all right?
okay.
Yeah, that's right. This
Yes.
podcast is taking off because of you and Joe. I should say Judge Joe Crowley now.
Yes.
So I want to raise a comment that has been sent to me on social media.
All right.
And this is, I'm not going to mention his name because he's actually a police officer. And there is something that if you're mentioned in the news or in social media by an outsider, you have to buy a carton.
Oh, my goodness.
Okay. So we don't want him to have to buy a carton
No.
unless it's for us. But he says to me, this has been and he's talking about the podcast. This has been an invaluable tool to understand legal issues and case law references through detective training, mate. Knowing what to look out for when putting together an investigation and such. Let them know I'm loving the work that they do and excited that you're going to be an addition.
Oh, wow.
So that's a testament to you and Judge Crowley.
Yes.
And where we are going with this podcast, where you guys have went with this podcast. So
That's good to hear.
feedback is coming in, and I would like to incorporate some of that moving forward.
Take on the mantle. Yes. Very
so
good.
the mailbox.
Oh, thanks.
So this topic I want to talk about is on domestic violence.
Mm.
So it is in the media. It is not going away.
No.
And I just read a report in the news about a member of parliament that had an alleged domestic violence incident, but it was withdrawn by police.
Right.
Now, the government is still questioning this member of parliament and whether or not he should be serving in the legislature. So it is in the media to this date and will continue to be. I think.
But even that
Yes.
is like a positive sign of progress, because we talked in our last episode about how domestic violence used to be a private matter. And so for that, where there's charges withdrawn, to be raised so publicly and him to be held to account, that's huge steps forward.
Well, I think it is and it isn't. So I guess I should clarify. There were no charges. It was a civil proceeding. Okay.
Right.
So it is a bit different on that front.
Okay.
So the alleged domestic violence incident was withdrawn from the magistrate's court.
Right.
Okay. So this conduct of the government members is after that was withdrawn. Okay. So that's something
Okay.
to think about, because we're going to touch base on a little bit of when we wrap this up on, all right, it was withdrawn. So how far do we take it moving forward?
Okay.
All right. I should note that before we get into this topic, that we have to give credence to, the police. They do a tough job. It's not easy.
Yes, I agree wholeheartedly. And listeners to the pod know that my second son wants to be a police officer, and I have so much respect for the good police officers. But we still have a way to go, Jay.
Oh, I know. And we can be critical, and we will be critical. But I just wanted to, enliven the fact that there are pressures. There's time, there's differences in rank, there's directions, and there's scenes and environments that a lot of people don't appreciate are somewhat confronting.
All right. And what about the training aspect?
Well, we need more training, but we'll get into that as well.
Good. Okay.
Because in my opinion, there's not enough.
Good. I
All
agree.
right?
Yeah.
Okay. It's important to note that this government was elected with a mandate, tough on crime approach. Whether you're pro-liberal or labor, they are tough on crime, majority government type stuff. And they're taking on approaches that are unique. And one such avenue is this new legislation that has just been tabled and adopted. It hasn't been royal assent, but it's the Domestic and Family Violence Protection and Other Legislation Amendment Bill. And we'll get to that in a moment. But the current process for domestic violence is that police go, they receive a call, they're detailed, they're supposed to investigate. There's a legal obligation to investigate, full stop.
Yep.
And then a decision is made. So one of the decisions that's made is we're going to take him to the watch house, and you're going to be lodged through the watch house with release conditions.
As a criminal matter?
No, as a civil matter.
Okay.
Okay. The other is that you're given a notice, a police protection notice, which says you can't do certain things, but you still have to go to court.
To have that formalized?
That's right. Yep. So a temporary protection order to be put in place. I'm going through this, ladies and gentlemen, because there is a current process in place, and both of those processes involve a judicial function. So a judicial officer making a determination whether or not A, a temporary order should be put in, and B, whether or not a final order. But it's a judicial officer that's making that decision and no one else.
Right.
It comes back to separation of powers. Don't want to get into a big academic thing here, but you've got the legislature enacting legislation. You got the executive branch carrying it out, and you've got the judicial branch making a determination.
Yes.
And it's super important. It's super important. So this legislation, its aim is to provide an alternative.
Right.
Okay? The alternative is to allow police to issue a 12-month police protection direction.
Which is what?
Is a piece of paper that says don't do something, and it lasts for 12 months. So it is a 12-month order.
And they can make that decision on
the spot.
Okay.
On the spot.
And so what sort of force would it have behind it? Like, what if they breached that type of an order?
Well, there is an offense for a breach.
Really?
Yes. So, I mean, I'm gauging your kind of reaction to something like that. Immediately, what's your thoughts on something like that? Should police be able to?
Well, I think in an ideal world, if our police had the benefit of extensive and effective training in domestic violence matters to be able to understand, identify all of the forms of domestic violence, then maybe that would be a good thing, because we know that the process at the moment is flawed. My other immediate thought is, great, another piece of paper that isn't worth the...
Well, and you make a good point, how much protection do you get from a piece of paper?
I don't think.
But what I will say, where we're going to disagree, is I'm not a fan of this proposal whatsoever.
Right.
Whatsoever. And I'll tell you why. Because there's not a judicial officer making the decision. Police are not judges.
No, but isn't the nature of DV, I mean, it's so prevalent and so frequent that police are called to DV matters. And if we have a streamlined process, provided they have the right training to support that, wouldn't that be better for victims?
We're going to go through that. So you mentioned the prevalence, and that's important to note. I do like looking at the odd stat once in a while.
Excellent.
So we're going to go
too.
through a few stats, all right? Nothing too laborious. But in 2019 to 2020, there was 28,312 applications. So domestic violence applications.
In Australia?
In Queensland.
In Queensland.
Yes. So
okay.
28,000. To the year later, in 2020 to 2021, there's 28,700. So a slight increase.
And that's when COVID happened.
Okay. And 2021 to 2022, there was a decrease. Not by much, by a couple hundred. And then an increase in 2023, and then a decrease in 2024, 27,857. Now that's 27,857 too many. I think we can agree on that.
And that's horrendous, but that is obviously only a fraction of
what's being
the
reported.
Victims.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yep. And again, across the board, male and female.
Yes.
Yes.
I do want to say,
yeah.
I acknowledge it's not a gendered crime.
Good.
But I do think we have to remember that most victims are female. and most perpetrators are male.
Yes, no, I think that you have to concede on that point. I think
Yes.
we have to concede on that point.
Because I feel very strongly about this situation of crisis I think we find ourselves in with the number of women who are being killed in a domestic setting on a weekly basis, or, when you average it out, like it is steadily increasing, and that is a huge concern.
Yeah. Well, I think domestic violence in general is a concern, and certainly the crimes that come from it only aggravate that as well. So that's the stats, and it's far too much. And so the government, in response, created a specialized court.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the specialized court has dedicated magistrates. They have coordinators, registrars, dedicated prosecutors.
Yeah.
All right.
And a lot of that was for continuity for the parties, but also for the magistrates, because then they have a full picture. Like, wasn't it partly because people would come to court and they'd have to tell their whole story to a fresh magistrate every time. They didn't have the knowledge of the history. So that's sort of to make it
case management.
Holistic. Yeah.
Case management, a little bit of familiarity. So there was those key features that were put in, included increased training. So that was a good initiative in terms of that. Now, I want to come back to this role. I mean, you talk about, perhaps the effectiveness of what has been in place hasn't been the greatest. And so this legislation, the DV minister is using it as a way to prioritize victims. These are not my words. Prioritize victim survivor safety concerns, provide effective response, and increase efficiencies.
Which all sounds positive.
Yes. And certainly if one looks at what the proposal says, all right, police go to an incident, they can issue a 12-month order. All right. Now, there are a couple ways that you'll be able to appeal it. One is to police. So you'll have a senior police officer potentially reviewing, although I don't like the sounds of that.
Why?
Well, I think that, you look when your time as a prosecutor, QP9s being signed off without all the elements made out. And so there is those concerns. I'm not saying it happens all the time.
No. QP9 being a police charge sheet.
That's right. A police brief or whatnot, not complying with all the elements and negating defenses and all of that. So certainly senior police sign off on those. So are they more likely to accept an appeal? I'm not with them on that. And then secondly is going to court. So we're back to going to court.
Right.
We're back going to the specialized courts. Now, I want to just ask you, what, in terms of police going to a domestic violence incident, we know that they need to investigate. It is a legal obligation. You have to investigate, full stop. It's not optional, as it should be. But in the case of a busy day, a busy shift, it's easier to issue a police protection direction and then move on.
So is there no threshold that needs to be met to justify issuing?
No, there's considerations that you have to take into place. You have to seek authority from a sergeant as well, so a more senior officer.
So presumably you'd have to have evidence to justify it.
Well, you would like to think so.
Oh.
Certainly. I mean, what I'm getting at is these situations are complex, they're volatile, emotions are high.
Yeah.
Okay. The difference between a police officer issuing me a speeding ticket is because he or she saw me speeding. There's evidence of me speeding. And in this instance, it's more than not the fact that police show up after something has happened.
Yes.
So you're relying on versions of events.
But also potentially circumstantial evidence if there's injuries. Or...
Oh, certainly. Certainly.
Would that be sufficient?
It probably would, but I would suggest that person or somebody needs to go to the watch house if there's injuries.
Right.
Okay. So the severity, I guess, is a factor.
Okay.
So in this concept of investigating, you have to investigate. We know that. The current process requires material to be provided to the court. With this new process, I'm not wondering if it's just going to prolong the court process. So let me try and run through this because I've been thinking about it. The current process, you show up, you investigate. Yes, it takes time. but you gather evidence. You door knock, you check out what's happening, and then you make a decision.
Yeah.
Okay. Either way, they're going to court.
Yeah.
This new alternative, and I think it's great the government's thinking outside the box. Whether you're Labor or Liberal, I think it's good. You need to start doing that. But this new process, I have a picture in my head of on a busy shift, and they are busy. I remember Eagleby. There was a shift where I had 4 domestic violence in one night.
Really?
And the paperwork involved in that is intense.
Right.
But you can't rush domestic violence.
No.
Domestic violence is not going away, and it's part of your job.
And
So-
I think the number of call-outs each day in Queensland, I saw on a police website, is hundreds of.
Oh, I
Like-
wouldn't even know the numbers. It's absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah.
Like it is not going away until something is done. And I'm hopeful that this, they find a way to do it.
Okay.
But all right. I lost my train of thought.
So you get called out.
Yes, you get called out, you go to the job, you investigate. In some communities, you're more busy than others. So as I said in Eagleby, it's pretty busy.
Yep.
All right. I just don't want to see this be the case where we're issuing you a PPD, you a PPD, you a PPD, and we're moving job to job to job.
Okay, and I understand that, but I mean, what's the downside of over issuing?
Okay, here we go. And it comes to, yeah, objection
You wanted me to have that
overruled.
question.
Yeah, I
didn't
did
you?
actually. Because I would suggest that a lot of people are going to challenge these PPDs. So they've got 2 options. You can go to the police route. They're not going to do that. I'm sorry. They're going to go to the court route. And then what's going to happen is because we've issued a PPD and moved on and moved on and moved on, we now have to go gather the evidence and investigate. So what's going to happen to that investigation? What's going to happen to that evidence?
Gone.
Well, I'm not saying it's going to be all gone, but I'm going to say a contemporaneous investigation with an incident of domestic violence is far better than a 28-day delay so that versions can change. Evidence can, who knows?
Yes, but
Yep.
Okay. But so if they're issuing these PPDs,
Mhm.
I would guess that not everyone will challenge them because unfortunately a lot of them will be deserved.
Well, that could be the case.
If we know the statistics, then statistically these call-outs are truthful in terms of the allegations.
I'm not with you on that. I'm really
Jay,
not. The
what do you
versions,
mean?
I say this, and I say this as somebody that has been on both sides of the bar table, and I know you're familiar with it as well. But versions typically change. Now, the extent of what has transpired might not, I think I just got bit, but versions typically change. There is, as I said, a heightened emotion and a variable of anger, perhaps. And so I like the full and frank investigation so that it's not that much of an issue. Because if a victim or an aggrieved wants to be properly protected, that requires a full and frank investigation.
Okay, but that sort of makes me a bit uncomfortable because isn't that what part of our problem is, that we are skeptical of these allegations? Isn't that?
I think you have to go, and I'll give you an example. Remind me to give you an example of an Eagleby story where I got it completely wrong. I'll be very candid with you. And that proved to me that I had to do it differently.
Right.
So I'll give it to you right now.
Okay.
All right. One of my first shifts in a domestic violence setting, we're detailed to a job, as you are. And in your mind, on your way to a job, you're starting to think, okay, what's going on? What's happening? What details do I have? And on this particular job, I got it wrong.
As in you didn't believe the victim?
I rocked up to the scene, saw who it was, a male and a female. The male was much larger in size than the female, and immediately I thought, what has he done to her?
Yes,
Okay.
understandable.
after I had conducted some investigations, it was the other way around. So my bias on going to that job was clearly evident, and it's still something I feel bad about.
But you hadn't
Never been to one.
incorrectly charged?
No, because I did a proper investigation.
But wouldn't you even need to do that for the PPDs?
I'm not, all it says in here is that it is a tool available, and that if there are certain circumstances, it is and can be used in addition to existing powers.
I don't know. I feel like we call out for action to be taken, for the government to step up and to address this domestic violence crisis.
Yes.
And so then when they make an effort to put in place processes that maybe there will be court hearings down the track in some, but that remove that, third step. Like you've got the call, you've got the police, and then usually you need the court.
Yes.
So we're streamlining it for these victims. Like, how is that not a step in the right direction?
Well, because my submission on that is that we're removing the court process. It is a police officer making a decision as opposed to a judicial officer. And I have a problem with that.
It's not the first time that there's been a blurring of the separation of powers, though. Like, it does happen.
Oh, it does happen.
And that doesn't necessarily make it wrong.
No.
Like, do you have, like, beyond it being not a judicial officer issuing it, like, are there other things that you don't about it?
I'm just not sure they need them. Right now they have a police protection notice, which is a piece of paper that says until court, you can't do this. And then the court will decide when you get there. And then there's the watch house. I guess I'm just cautious. I just don't want to be seeing, and let me come back to this. I think back when I was a first-year constable, and I remember you telling us that your son is interested in being a police officer. And I'm not sure that authority is something that Jay should have had as a first-year constable.
Yeah, I do think the age of our police officers and the fact they can go to the academy so young is concerning. So I'm suggesting that.
Oh, I don't think it's concerning. I think that
they're so young, though, Jay. And what life experience do they have?
Well, that's a question. I mean, but one of my fellow recruits, he or she still had his L plate or P plate or whatever plate it was.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
So I've said to my son, absolutely go to the academy, but I want you to be a little bit older. So he's going to, do some study before he goes, and hopefully that will help him with his, knowledge of life and give him some time to mature a little before he's put into these situations that are so fraught and so
unpredictable
and complex.
Yeah, domestic violence was one of the jobs that I don't want to say dreaded, because you're there to help, right?
Yes.
But at the same token, you are in such an unknown atmosphere, and the kitchen is the worst place to be.
Oh, I can't imagine.
So I just, if we want to get back to having a meaningful impact, I do not want to dissolve a proper, thorough investigation. And my argument is that a contemporaneous one, yes, it's going to take time, but it does.
But I mean, so two things.
Yes.
I think time is sometimes a victim's biggest enemy, because once there are processes happening, that can be a dangerous time for a victim once their abuser is being investigated or being targeted by authorities or being called out. That can be a very dangerous time for the victim.
Certainly if they're out in the public.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I guess more concerningly for me is I don't think I have an issue with police issuing these kinds of orders. My problem is I just don't think they're worth anything. I think that breaching a domestic violence order happens all of the time. I don't know if I've told this story before, but I spoke to a police officer once who had just breached a guy on a AVO. So he'd issued him the breach notice and all of that sort of thing at the station. And this guy said to him, "Thanks, mate, but I'll see you soon because I'm going back there this afternoon." And that police officer said, "I couldn't do anything. Until he breached it again, I didn't have any powers. I couldn't stop him. I couldn't hold him."
No.
And he did go, and he badly beat up his partner that afternoon.
No, and I'm with you on that. A piece of paper is not going to stop somebody from doing something, and that's the unfortunate thing. I mean, it's a piece of paper.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really have proper bite if you breach it, you know. Yes, you have to go to court and you've been breached, but a lot of these people, they don't care. They don't care if they're back in court. Sure. Like Magistrate Strofield, Colin Strofield, he's retired now, but he
was the first magistrate I appeared in front of, by the way.
One of my all-time favorite judicial legends. But so he ran the DV court in Southport when it was the pilot program. And I was fortunate enough to work with him with some of my students. We got to be part of that to a degree.
Yep.
And so I had lots of chats to him. And he said when he was in a rural placement, not as a DV specific magistrate, just general magistrate, he would have couples come in who were subject to DV orders and they would be so familiar with him. Morning, you know, he'd see them on the street. They'd be like, "How you going?" You know, like just, it didn't faze them to come to court. They'd have full on arguments with each other in the courtroom. And Magistrate Strofield said there was one couple he had to say, "Hello, talk to me."
Yeah, I'm in the room here.
That's right. And so I think, well, what is the sting in breaching one of those?
I've seen some hefty sentences on breaching. So I think
because they committed offences in the breach. But so if they're still just harassing or turning up or watching, like
that's still an offence.
But what punishment are they getting for that?
I've seen some good ones.
Like what?
Oh, well, you're depending on if they have history.
Oh, yeah.
You know.
But like actual time in prison?
Yeah, it varies on what the offense allegations are. If there's violence, you will see a period of incarceration.
Oh, and I agree with that.
Whether it's suspended is a different story.
No, I know that happens, but I'm talking about the ones who breach it in a more insidious way, who still are a presence in that victim's life, who are breaching the distance
or on the cusp of breaching.
Or that's right. Like, you know, there aren't real consequences there. And I mean, I'm concerned because Go
ahead. Sorry, I've got a little bit more faith.
We're about to have coercive control
prosecutable
in Queensland this month. And my big fear with that is, yes, great, we have an offence for coercive control, which I'm actually going to talk about next week. But what's the reality going to be? Like, okay, A, are we going to be prosecuting it actually? And B, how do we prove it? And then C, what's even the penalty going to be because there's no violence necessarily, because there's no injury that is visible. You know, it's this, I feel like some of the reforms are a knee-jerk reaction. Here, community, look what we're doing, but then the reality. So here, look what we're doing. We're going to give police more powers, but it's just another piece of paper.
But it is a piece of paper that has lasting effects. These temporary orders, so the traditional process, if you go to court and you receive a temporary order, that can have lasting effects on employment, whether or not you work with children, whether or not you have a firearm. And so straight away, without challenging or testing the evidence that police obtain in the decision-making process, where they issue you a 12-month order, I have a problem with that. It's not a judicial officer. It's not Magistrate Gary Fingers saying, all right, this is what happened.
But does it go in there? Like, is it a conviction of anything?
Well, it's not a conviction, but it goes in as part of a domestic violence order against someone.
So would they have to disclose that at a job interview, for example?
If that was part of the employment requirements, absolutely.
Okay.
So we have a situation here where we have first-year Constable Jay on a busy shift saying, and I hope that it doesn't happen. If it does happen, I hope first-year constables out there will say, I don't feel comfortable with this. I'm going to deal with it my way. And hopefully they go with the status quo in terms of dealing with it.
Mm.
But I would hate to see a first-year constable feel all sorts of pressures and just say, here, you get one, you get one, you get one, you get one, and we'll worry about it later.
Okay, so my other question
Sure.
then is with the PPDs.
Yes.
PPDs.
It is a police protection direction.
Okay, so if they are called to a domestic violence incident, is that just one option?
It is.
So they don't have to issue it?
No.
So they may just be reserved for the very clear-cut circumstances where it's warranted.
And I think you're right, and I hope you're right. I hope it's a case that police show up, they see something in terms of, physically observing or hearing domestic violence, and then they have a conversation and say, here, this is what you're going to be getting.
Or do you think it's a question then, and maybe this isn't practical, I don't know, but we talked at the start about the need for, training. Like, is it that where we have domestic violence calls, it does need to be more senior officers who are deployed?
I hadn't thought about more senior officers being deployed. I had thought about maybe certain task force. I don't know how logistically they can.
Well, and in fact, I think in the UK, they have specialist police units for domestic violence.
Yes.
So maybe that is, it would have to be quite big, I suppose, with the number of call-outs. But is that maybe a way to counteract your concerns if you have police officers who are specifically trained, experienced, understanding of domestic violence, who are getting these call-outs and then having to make these decisions as to whether or not to issue the PPDs?
I think that would be a very positive step in facilitating a program like this. I'm just not sure how that would happen in terms of the current police service. I mean,
Why?
the training from, and this is my opinion, is very rushed.
Right.
And I think that this is something that they would have to be brought offline with. So perhaps when they're doing their, firearms training and whatnot, a period of time.
But so when you have other specialist police units,
yes,
and I don't know enough about
well,
it.
there's CERT,
but don't they get specific extra training?
They are a unit in and of themselves, yes.
So couldn't it be like a unit like that then?
I just think with 28,757, it's going to be very difficult.
Right.
Your
unit
a lot of
couldn't
these
handle that.
You couldn't handle it, and a lot of these jobs are priority 2, which is a very serious lights and sirens, we're going type deal. So I want to get back to just comment on the ramifications of these 12-month orders, and I want to talk about human rights. Because as a Canadian, we take our human rights very seriously with the Charter. The government has acknowledged that the rights that may be limited to police unilaterally making a 12-month order include equality before the law, freedom of movement, freedom of expression, freedom of association, the right to property, the right to privacy and reputation, cultural rights, liberty and security of the person, and the right to a fair hearing.
Are there any rights left?
Well, I think there are, but I'm
I
not,
know that's substantial, isn't it?
So it is. I mean, are we valuing, and this is a question, I guess, for you and the listeners, are we valuing human rights when we A, acknowledge them, but B, simply put out a statement to say that they might be infringed upon?
But so this is one of the things that I struggle with our human rights legislation. So you mentioned the Charter.
Yeah, it's a constitutional guarantee.
And I am certainly no expert in Canadian constitutional law, but because we have so many Canadians here that I teach, and we do moots that are based on the Charter, I have familiarity to a degree.
Yes.
And I think the Charter is excellent. I think we should have a Charter like that. My issue with our Human Rights Act is that it is just a piece of legislation. So it can be amended at any time. That's the first thing.
That's right.
Secondly, every other piece of legislation that gets passed talks about how it is compatible with the Human Rights Act. And that section of the explanatory notes is usually all of the ways rights are encroached upon and the justification for why that's okay. And so then I think, well, what's the point?
Yeah, well, that was the question, and that's something that I think everyone has to think about. Are we taking human rights seriously when we have 10 or so rights that are infringed upon or
That's a
potentially
lot.
infringed upon?
So
That's a lot.
what is their justification?
Well, that there is a need to deal with domestic violence, and that in the process, these rights might be infringed upon.
And so then the part of me that is calling out for reform and improvement in domestic violence in Australia says, okay, so maybe it is justified.
And that's what they're relying on, is that maybe it is justified. But I mean, we often hear that, and time is a factor, paperwork is a factor. So maybe perhaps one solution is to also look at the paperwork and the process itself. I can recall, like I said, I think 4 jobs in one shift. When you have to get the court paperwork ready, it takes a lot of time.
Yeah.
So we often talk about substance over form in the law, and perhaps slimmer paperwork with similar content, but slimmer processes to get that before the court sooner, or perhaps a better triage of priority and jobs that are dispatched.
And then what about, I think I remember this right, but isn't the Queensland Police Union calling for a domestic violence offence?
Yeah.
So what would that look like? And would that not be adding to the paperwork load and the...
Well, it would be treated similar. I'm assuming, I haven't seen the legislation, but it'd be treated as similar as a criminal offense, which I prefer. Where I was at the end of my tenure as a police officer, I'm more like you, that a piece of paper on the night of a very volatile situation is not going to protect much. We're going to the watch house, and I'm going to lodge you through the watch house and put you before the court, and then have a judicial officer sift through the material and make a determination.
Do you think that would have a more deterrent effect? Or do you think it's not actually going to make a difference if it's an offence or not to our perpetrators?
I think that probably with stiff penalties, I'm not mandatory minimum kind of guy. Discretion is key. But I think that
mandatory minimums allow for discretion still.
Well, they certainly can, unless the offense conduct is lesser than what previous decisions would generally attract a mandatory minimum. I'm not a mandatory minimum person, because the whole reason for the Penalties and Sentences Act is the sentence should be just in all the circumstances.
I know. But then I think...
we talk about having somebody make a cell phone call to somebody, which is close to breaching, versus somebody showing up on property. And there's a difference between those two patterns or those behaviors. So if we're paneling one sentence that attracts all of them as a minimum, I see that as problematic.
Except maybe isn't that where we have to be heading, because breaching is not given a punishment that hurts.
Well, and that's certainly some opinion out there against
my opinion
against the judiciary. I'm not there. I have a lot more faith than a lot of the public.
I don't know. I think deterrence as a sentencing principle,
yes,
like imposing a penalty to send a message, I don't think that works, because that's predicated on offenders A, knowing what's going on in court.
That's right.
And B, going, hold on.
Ventilation of it in the public.
If I do this, I'm going to get that. That doesn't work. But I think if there was a known outcome, like I come back to Singapore, where I was once told that if you throw gum on the street, you'll be taken to prison. And so nobody throws gum on the street. And I think...
I have a story.
Yeah, go
ahead. You finish your thought.
No, I just think maybe that's the kind of impetus we need to reduce. I don't know, but you tell me.
I'll tell you in a bit, but I agree that, if we're looking at denunciation, it needs to be ventilated differently. So that the community says, all right, if I am making this telephone call, this is what I can expect.
That's right. And so it might be minor, but the ramifications are going to be serious.
Yeah.
So that might be the thing to stop or reduce.
It could be. Certainly, I think it's an option. And like I said, I don't care if you're a liberal, Labor, or Green. Well, Greens probably won't get in, but any of them, like as long as we're having these discussions and looking at options and alternatives and thinking outside the box. If you take a look at Canada, for instance, the Supreme Court is reserving a decision right now to have domestic violence a novel tort.
Right.
So that adds a different variable.
Yes.
Okay.
With a lower standard of proof.
That's right. So I guess where I'm at with this is I struggle with first year Constable Jay being given that authority without judicial oversight.
Yep.
I struggle because an investigation must be thorough and impartial. And is it better to have a contemporaneous investigation as opposed to a delayed investigation?
Yes.
And I'm on the contemporaneous side.
Yes. But I'm on the side of let's do what we can to.
Let's just get in there and get it done.
Yes.
Hey, issue them out like candy at Halloween.
Maybe that will. I don't know. It's such a hard.
It is. I
topic.
see if we're looking at efficiency and effectiveness, all right, you look at the court process and we want to protect aggrieved. Is protecting aggrieved conducting that investigation right now or later when we don't know the status of the evidence and then it's challenged in court?
Yeah,
I can see it now.
out.
I can see it now that a PPD will be issued. They're not going to go through the police appeal. They're going to go to the court appeal. A solicitor is going to pick up. If you get like a Daniel McShane or somebody picking up something like this, they're going to challenge it. Then the investigation is going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, I do. I see what you're saying. But so is this legislation passed?
No, it isn't. So this is early days yet. That's why I wanted to have a conversation with it. And I want the listeners to start thinking about it too, because it still has yet to go through the committee process.
Okay, right.
So, the takeaway points for me is it's great that we're having these conversations.
Yes.
We need more conversations. But we need to also look at the human rights side of things. We need to look at the impact. Yes, the practicality of it. And look at the fact that these orders, whether they're temporary or final, have real implications.
That's the least persuasive one for me.
All right. But the ease for which you receive one.
I know. And I know that there are, I say frivolous, but the non-meritorious complaints. I do know that. But I think they are far fewer than the ones that actually need to be addressed.
Yeah, and I don't think I'd go that far, but I would say that they are fewer. But there's nothing in the legislation that deals with that either.
Right.
And I feel like we're missing out on the fact that there are people there, whether you're male or female, and I'm not saying this across the board, I might get a little bit of flack, but the complaints are not genuine.
I know.
They might be used for family law proceedings, or they might be used because of extramarital affair or any number of variables. And there should be some safeguard in the legislation somewhere that if it is deemed vexatious or frivolous, that there should be ramifications for that.
Okay, and I do. I agree with that as well. And maybe on some issues you and Joe have more in common because he dealt with a lot of those kinds of frivolous claims and you've probably come across them in your practice.
I do, and I continue to see them. And it's not always the case.
No.
But when I receive an affidavit down the track from somebody, whether it's male or female, that effectively says, I misled police because I didn't think they would take them seriously, I have a problem with that.
Yeah. Jay, I don't know. We're not going to come up with a solution.
No,
today,
we aren't.
are we?
But it's good that we're having a conversation about it. I guess the takeaway point for me on this is police officers are not judicial officers. Evidence should be tested, challenged, thorough investigation, impartial investigation, which for the most part it is. And the role of the courts is vitally important in solving and working through domestic violence.
Yes, except my final thought.
Yes.
My takeaway is what we've got at the moment isn't reducing the numbers of domestic violence incidents.
Sure.
So we do need to think of alternatives to try and curtail this crisis.
Yes.
So let's not be too hasty to.
No. And we're afforded that because it's still early days with the legislation. We have this legislation, the coercive control, which I'm not over, by the way, so I don't want to speak to that. But certainly it is a conversation that needs to be had.
Yeah.
And variables to consider: the role of police, the role of judges, the role of the aggrieved, the role of, us as a society. If we see something and we hear something, we have to do something.
And I think any awareness is a step in the right direction. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much for
Thanks,
that.
Jay.
You bet.
See you.
Thank you for listening to the episode. If you enjoyed it, please rate and review the podcast. If you're interested in clips, check out @Justice Matters Pod on TikTok and Instagram.